Good morning, Level Ground. In the introduction to his little book, The Case for the Psalms, Tom Wright observes that the Psalms have historically been the great hymn book of the Bible, the daily lifeblood of Christians, and of course the Jewish people from the earliest times. Wright then proceeds to make the case in this great book that they ought still be such for the church. Because, after all, the Psalms are not narrative history like Exodus or Judges or Kings or the Gospels or any of those books. They're not law codes like Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy. They're not even prophecy like Isaiah or Ezekiel or Malachi or whatever. They are the Psalms. They're poetry, right? They're verse. They're song. They are expressions of praise, expressions of worship, expressions of lament, and expressions, above all, of prayer. And as such, Wright suggests, the psalmist's words are meant to be words for us, God's people, to always be praying anew. Now, when we do this, when we begin to speak the words of the Psalms as our own words, one of the attributes that stands out to me, first of all, is just how direct these words often are. The psalmists do not mince words. They are not afraid to tell God exactly what they are thinking, exactly how they feel, and exactly what they think God ought to do in any given situation. For this reason, I kind of like to think of the Psalms as the quote unquote, the real talk of the Bible, right? They're not gussied up nice words, right? They are words that are spoken out of the depths of being, of heartfelt emotion, words that express the ups and probably more relevantly for our world these days, the downs of real life. And this actually, I think, is one of the great gifts of this book. Not only do these words, these Psalms, give us permission to speak this way to God, but the Psalms give us the words with which to do so. To get a sense of what I mean, I'm going to read the opening words of the Psalm we're looking at this morning, Psalm 17. And as I do, I would invite you to try to not only listen to the words, but to feel them. Feel the conviction of these words. Feel the gut level nature of this outcry. Psalm 17, verse 1. Hear me, Yahweh. My plea is just. Listen to my cry. Lord, hear my prayer. King David, the one to whom this psalm is attributed, is here calling out to God for justice, appealing for God to hear his case. Now, we don't have any real way of knowing what exactly the situation was that David was facing, but there's a few things that seem pretty clear from what he says. In his eyes, he is in the right. He is being opposed by some people that he's pretty clear are wicked, evil, and he is confident that if God would only look at this situation, God would see that this is the case, he would act, and David would be vindicated. Now, as far as the Psalms go, much of this is actually pretty familiar. Many of David's Psalms, including, for example, Psalm 34 that Aaron spoke about last week, many of them appear to have come out of the numerous periods of David's life during which he was subject to intense, fierce, often violent opposition. If ever there was a guy who knew what it was like to have people like those described in this psalm out to get him, people who were out to destroy him, enemies who hated him, breathed out threats like lions surrounding him and longing to bring him down to the ground, it was David. Again and again, it seems, David faced situations like that. And again, David turned to God in prayer and cried out for God to listen, to look, and to do something. Listen, I, your righteous servant, cry out to you. Look, I am surrounded by adversaries, arrogant, wicked individuals who long to destroy me. And God, do something. Act. Vindicate me. See the right. Save me. Because it's in you that I am seeking refuge. Listen, God. Look, God. Do something. So if, as Wright argues, it's words like this that are meant to give expression to the hearts of God's people today, how might they do so? I don't know where your mind goes, but mine, I find it pretty hard for my mind not to be filled with images and videos from the past weeks of people who have exactly this outcry on their lips. Exactly this deep longing for justice in their hearts. And exactly this desperate hope that the God that they are putting their trust in would look upon the injustice they are facing, the evil by which they are surrounded, and would do something about it. My mind fills with those who knew and who loved George Floyd, the man whose life was brutally, needlessly, and horrifically taken by a police officer kneeling on his neck for 9 minutes 13 days ago. How many of those who knew and loved him, his family, his mother, his daughters, his friends, how many of them have in their anguish and pain and rage and sorrow screamed forth words like this? Listen, look, do something. How many of those who knew and loved Breonna Taylor, who would have turned 27 on Friday, had she not been killed while sleeping in her own bed? Listen, look, do something. How many of those who knew and loved Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Eric Rice, the list goes on and on. How many of those who have taken to the streets across the United States and around the world over the past days because they have suffered directly or indirectly the pain and injustice and dehumanization of this evil that we call racism? The wicked have surrounded us, they cry out. Their hardened hearts do not see our humanity, they wail. In their arrogance, they ignore our cries for justice. They lament. Listen, look, do something. And my friends, lest we make the mistake of thinking that this is a them problem and not an us problem, that racism is just an issue south of the border, we need only think for a moment about Canada's history of systemic oppression, domination, indeed, I think it's fair to say destruction of Indigenous peoples and cultures. Not to mention the ingrained institutional racism that still continues today in our country. In this land, too, those with eyes to see are crying out, listen, God. Look, God. Do something. David's words, therefore, become our words. Words to express the longing that God will set right that which is even now still so very wrong in the world in which we live. We cry out for justice. The question is, on what basis do we ask for it? So this is where I need to admit that there's an aspect of this psalm that makes me a little bit uncomfortable. Because if you read it, David comes across as pretty confident that God is going to hear and respond to his appeal. Why? Well, at first glance, it seems that David's confidence arises from two things. First, the justice of his cause, but second, his own righteousness as the one bringing the charge against the wicked. Just listen to the opening words again. Hear me, Yahweh, my plea is just. Hear my prayer. It does not rise from deceitful lips. Let my vindication come from you. May your eyes see what is right. And it becomes even more clear in verses 3-5, where David basically says, look, God, go ahead, right? Search me. I've got nothing to hide. Even if you were to examine me when I was at my most vulnerable, when I'm sleeping, my mind free to roam wherever it'll go, right? Even there, God, you're not going to find any dark secrets. No plans for evil, no concealed transgression, no ulterior motives, not even in the deepest, darkest, most hidden thoughts I keep to myself. It's not there. In all I've done, I've kept myself from the ways of the violent. I've stayed on that proverbial straight and narrow. My feet have never, ever slipped from the path that you set before me. David knows, he is certain that he's on the side of justice, the side of righteousness, and those that are standing against him are the evil and the wicked. And it's out of that conviction, it seems, that David prays, God, give me what I deserve. Now, maybe, just maybe, you're feeling a little uneasy with the language of that last statement in particular. And if so, I don't blame you. It makes me uncomfortable, right? Is any one of us very comfortable with making that kind of a claim? Can any one of us really join with David in praying like that? And if not, if the idea of praying in such a way, of letting our appeal to God stand or fall on the basis of our own faultlessness, if that fills us with a certain amount of trepidation, then how can David's words become our words? How can we share David's confidence that God will hear, that God will act, if we can't share David's apparent confidence in his own righteousness? Another way of saying what I'm trying to ask here is, does this psalm suggest that God's willingness to listen to our prayers is contingent upon or is tied to our willingness to obey God's commands? Well, thankfully, I think that if we take a little bit more of a more careful look, I think it becomes clear that if we try to make that the main thing we're taking away from the psalm, we're going to pretty quickly misunderstand David's main point. If we get caught up in thinking that really the psalm is all about who David considers himself to be, his own confidence in his own righteousness, we're going to miss the main point altogether. Because, and here, if you've drifted off at all, this is kind of the main point, the one thing I want you to take away from this sermon. So listen up, okay? Here, at the heart of the psalm is not the character of David. At the heart of this psalm is the character of God. The hope of this psalm is not found in the identity of the prayer. The hope of this psalm is found in the identity of the one to whom he prays. David speaks as one who, yes, is confident about the reality of the situation he's facing, confident in the justice of his own action, but more confident, or more importantly, David speaks as one who is confident in the identity and the character of the God he addresses, confident in what this means for how God will hear and respond to his words. So if we read the psalm from that angle, if we read the psalm seeking to understand what it reveals first and foremost about God rather than about David, what can we come away with? First of all, Yahweh is the God who listens. In verse 1 alone, David uses 3 different verbs for listening. Hear, Shema, a just cause, O God, O Lord. Listen, Kashav, to my cry. Hear, Azan, my prayer. These words are repeated in verse 6. Turn your ear, Azan, to me, and hear, Shema, my prayer. Now, it's worth noting even more so that this last statement follows immediately after a powerful declaration of faith. The beginning of verse 6, I call on you, my God, for you will answer me. Did you catch this? David states his unshakable certainty that his outcry will be heard. Hear my prayer, God, for I know you will answer. Request and outcome, side by side. David is certain that Yahweh, his Lord, is the God who hears. God's heart is not hardened to his people's cries for justice. God listens and God answers. Second, Yahweh is a God of steadfast love, love that brings deliverance from oppression. The definitive expression of what this psalm has to say about the identity and character of God and how that relates to David's appeal for justice, I would argue, comes in verse 7. The opening 2 lines of this verse, where we read, show me the wonders of your great love, you who save by your right hand. These are actually only 4 words in Hebrew. Palah, Chesed, Yasha, Chasa, each of which resonates with the history of how God has acted towards his people and the relationship that grows between them as a result. First, Palah, a word that communicates the wondrous, extraordinary things God has done that are hard to understand. The things Yahweh has done for and the ways Yahweh has acted towards his people that have caused them to wonder, to be in awe. Chesed, God's steadfast loving kindness. Or, since I have a 4-year-old daughter, as Sally Lloyd-Jones, the author of the Jesus Storybook Bible, renders it, God's never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. Yasha, to deliver or save, one of the fundamental actions with which Israel associated their God, by which they knew who God was. Who is Yahweh? Yahweh is the one who yashas us, saves us, delivers us from our oppressors, most notably in the Exodus from Egypt. And finally, chasa, to take refuge. A very common word in the Psalms. Yahweh is the one in whom the psalmist finds his refuge, his protection. Palah, chesed, yasha, chasa. Wondrously show your steadfast love, Savior of those who seek refuge. That is the very heart of this psalm. These are the words from which the appeal as a whole draws its lifeblood. Because this is the God to whom David appeals in this prayer. This is the God to whom he looks for justice. With these words, we are reminded that our cries for justice must not be separated from the God who alone is in position to grant it. David vocalizes his desire that God would act as God has acted in the past. David asks that God's response to his appeal would be in keeping with God's character, which God has made known to his people over and over and over again throughout their history. David asks God to again do wondrous deeds of steadfast love, to again provide protection, to deliver one who seeks refuge in him. Because of who David knows God to be, David comes to God for justice. Because God's justice flows out of who God is. And so, facing violence, injustice, resolute hatred, evil, David throws himself upon God's justice, which is to say, David throws himself upon God, entrusting his own fate to God's steadfast love, from which his justice flows. Sisters and brothers, this is the good news of this psalm. Facing injustice, hatred, violence, evil, David cries out to the God that he knows and that he longs to know more, and he lays himself bare before him. David does so trusting in God as the one who in steadfast love delivers those who place themselves in God's care. In the same way, facing injustice, we can turn to the God that we know, that we long to know more, and we can cry out, laying ourselves bare. Listen, look, do something. Listen, we cry out, to the God who turns his ear to the anguished screams of hearts that have been torn apart by pain and loss, by murder and hatred. To the God who listens to the cries of Black Lives Matter and justice for George Floyd and I can't breathe and is my son next. To the God who hears even the silence of those who have been numbed into hopelessness by the seemingly overwhelming power of the oppression, hatred, and injustice that they have been crushed under for so long. Listen, look, do something. Look, we cry out to the God who sees the suffering, violence, destruction, the bloodshed, the sorrow, the tears, and the rage, the protests and the demonstrations. Listen, look, do something. Do something, we cry out to the God who, hear this, sisters and brothers, not only will act, but has already acted, has already dealt the definitive blow to the power of evil in and through Jesus Christ our Lord. For this, my friends, is the gospel. In Jesus, God identifies with the outcasts, the poor, and the oppressed. In Jesus, God brought about deliverance, justice, and peace by taking the violence, the hatred, the injustice of sin upon himself in the most wondrous act of self-giving love creation will ever know. When the beauty and the grace and the wonder of this truth, that in fulfillment of David's hope to see God's face, we have seen in Jesus exactly that. that Jesus is the one who has made God known to us, when that truth captivates us, such that the deepest desire of our hearts is to know this God and be known by this God more fully, then, yes, the words of David become our words too. For to whom else would we want to turn for protection, refuge, deliverance, and, yes, justice, than to the God made known to us in Jesus? In whom else could we ever place our hope?